The rain fell like judgment over Milan that November night, each drop hammering against the cobblestones of Via Dante with relentless fury. The city's ancient architecture stood silent witness as emergency lights painted the wet pavement in strobes of red and blue. Detective Marco Santini lay on the ground, his blood mixing with rainwater, forming dark rivers that disappeared into the storm drains. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each one more labored than the last. 2 bullets had torn through his chest during what should have been a routine follow-up on a cold case. He had been walking to his car after interviewing a witness in a cafe when the shots rang out from a passing motorcycle. No warning, no negotiation, just professional violence executed with surgical precision. His partner, Detective Sofia Moretti, had been 20 meters behind him, stopping to take a phone call. She heard the shots, saw Marco fall, and her world collapsed into chaos. Sofia reached him within seconds, her hands trembling as she pressed against the wounds, trying to stem the bleeding that wouldn't stop. Around them, uniformed officers created a perimeter, while paramedics rushed forward with equipment that everyone knew would arrive too late. Marco's eyes, usually sharp with intelligence and dark humor, had already begun to dim. He looked up at Sofia with an expression that transcended pain, something closer to urgency mixed with profound sadness. The paramedics worked frantically, but Marco's hand found Sofia's wrist with surprising strength. He pulled her closer, his lips moving with effort. The surrounding officers leaned in, straining to hear over the rain and sirens. What came out was barely a whisper, but in the sudden hush that fell over the scene, every syllable carried weight. Lorenzo De Vincenzi. The name hit the assembled police officers like a physical blow. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Hands froze on equipment. Even the paramedics paused for a fraction of a second before resuming their futile attempts to save a man already slipping away. Because Lorenzo De Vincenzi wasn't just another name in Milan's underworld. He was the apex predator, the man who controlled shipping, construction, and half the legitimate businesses in northern Italy. Politicians sought his favor. Judges looked the other way, and cops who got too close to him ended up dead or worse, corrupted. Marco Santini died 17 seconds after speaking that name, his hand still clutching Sofia's as his final breath rattled in his chest. The rain continued to fall, washing away the blood, but not the implications of his last words. Sofia sat back on her heels, staring at her fallen partner's face, now peaceful despite the violent end. She had worked with Marco for 6 years. She knew him as a man of unshakable integrity, someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated, and now his dying declaration pointed directly at the most dangerous man in Milan. The penthouse overlook. Across the city, in a glass and steel tower that dominated Milan's skyline, Lorenzo De Vincenzi stood before floor-to-ceiling windows, watching rain cascade down the glass. His penthouse occupied the entire top floor, decorated with understated elegance that spoke of wealth so profound it didn't need to announce itself. Original Renaissance paintings hung beside modern abstract works. Antique furniture shared space with minimalist design. Everything perfectly curated, everything under complete control. Lorenzo was 42 years old, though the silver threading through his dark hair suggested someone who had lived through more than his years indicated. His face carried the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from decisions made in darkness, from bearing weights that would crush ordinary men. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, even at this late hour, always prepared for the unexpected calls that came with his position. Behind him, his consigliere, Dante Russo, stood at a respectful distance, holding a tablet that contained news Lorenzo already knew he wouldn't want to hear. The call had come 15 minutes earlier from a contact inside the police department who provided early warnings about investigations, raids, and developments that might impact the organization. The information was simple and devastating. A decorated detective had been murdered, and with his dying breath, he had spoken Lorenzo's name. Dante had delivered this news with his characteristic calm, but Lorenzo could see the concern behind his advisor's carefully neutral expression. Lorenzo continued staring at the city below, at the millions of lights that represented lives he influenced without those people ever knowing his name. He had built his empire through calculated violence when necessary, strategic alliances when possible, and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate threats before they materialized. He had survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 government investigations, and countless challenges from rivals who thought his position was something they could take. Each threat had been neutralized, each enemy removed, each problem solved with the efficiency that had made him legendary. But this was different. Marco Santini's name carried memories that Lorenzo had buried deep, locked away in a part of his mind he rarely accessed. 12 years ago, before Lorenzo had fully consolidated his power, before his name carried the weight it did now, he had been caught in a situation that should have ended with his death or imprisonment. A rival family had set an elaborate trap, framing him for a murder he didn't commit, with evidence so carefully constructed that even his own lawyers advised him to flee the country. Detective Marco Santini had been assigned to investigate. He was young then, ambitious, known for his by-the-book approach and his inability to be compromised. Lorenzo had expected arrest, possibly assassination in custody. Instead, Santini had done something unexpected. He had investigated the case properly, not looking for easy answers, not accepting the convenient narrative presented by the evidence, but actually following every lead, questioning every assumption, dismantling the frame piece by piece until the truth emerged. Santini had exposed the rival family's scheme, and in doing so, had inadvertently saved Lorenzo's life. They had spoken only once after that. A brief conversation in a parking garage where Santini made clear he hadn't done it for Lorenzo's benefit, but because justice demanded truth, not convenience. Lorenzo had offered money, protection, anything Santini wanted. The detective had refused everything, warning Lorenzo that their paths would cross again, and next time, if Lorenzo was guilty, no power would save him. It was the last time they had been in the same room. Now Santini was dead, and his final act had been to speak Lorenzo's name. Not as an accusation, Lorenzo's instincts, honed through decades of reading threats and opportunities, told him that. If Santini had wanted to name his killer, he would have used different words, provided more context. This was something else. This was a message, coded in the simplicity of a single name, delivered by a dying man who knew exactly what weight that name carried. Lorenzo turned from the window to face Dante. His consigliere was 63, grey-haired and sharp-eyed, a man who had served Lorenzo's father before him and understood the organization's inner workings better than anyone alive. Dante's loyalty had been tested and proven countless times, and Lorenzo trusted him with details he shared with no one else. But even with Dante, Lorenzo maintained certain boundaries, kept certain thoughts private. The implications of Santini's death cascaded through Lorenzo's mind like falling dominoes. Someone had killed a police detective. Not just any detective, but one known for his integrity and his dangerous intelligence. Someone had executed this hit with professional precision, leaving no witnesses, no evidence, no trail to follow. And someone had done this in a way that ensured Santini's dying words would point directly at Lorenzo, making him the primary suspect in a cop killing that would bring the full weight of law enforcement down on his organization. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a message, a chess move, the opening gambit in a game Lorenzo hadn't known he was playing. Someone inside his world wanted him destroyed, and they were using the one weapon that could actually threaten him. Not rival gangsters or ambitious politicians, but the focused fury of the police force investigating one of their own's murder. Lorenzo walked to his desk, a massive piece crafted from wood salvaged from a 16th-century palazzo, and opened a drawer that held files on every key member of his organization. 42 men and 7 women held positions of significant power within his empire. Each had been vetted, tested, proven through years of service. Each had sworn loyalty, not just through words, but through actions that tied them irrevocably to the organization. Each had wealth and status they would never have achieved in the legitimate world. And one of them was a traitor. Unraveling threads. The rain continued through the night and into the dawn, turning Milan's streets into rivers that reflected the grey sky above. Lorenzo had not slept. He sat in his study, surrounded by files and photographs, reconstructing every major decision, every significant operation, every moment where information might have leaked or loyalty might have shifted. Dante had joined him at 3 in the morning, bringing espresso and the preliminary reports from their contacts in the police department. The investigation into Santini's murder had already taken on the character of a crusade. The detective's funeral would be held in 3 days, with the police commissioner, the mayor, and representatives from Rome all planning to attend. Media coverage was intense, with every news outlet running stories about the fallen hero and demanding justice. And at the center of every report, either explicitly stated or carefully implied, was Lorenzo's name. Detective Sofia Moretti had been assigned to lead the investigation, a choice that struck Lorenzo as either incredibly brave or deliberately provocative on the part of the police leadership. She had been Santini's partner, which meant she would pursue this case with personal intensity. But it also meant she might understand the message Santini had tried to send. Lorenzo needed to reach her, to communicate somehow that he wasn't the enemy here, that they were both targets of the same conspiracy. But any attempt at contact would be interpreted as witness tampering, obstruction of justice, or worse. Dante brought news that made the situation more complex. The ballistics report on the bullets that killed Santini matched a weapon that had been used in 3 other murders over the past 18 months, murders that remained unsolved, but that investigators had attributed to Lorenzo's organization. The connection was circumstantial but damning, creating a narrative of a crime boss finally eliminating a persistent investigator. The press was already running with the story, and Lorenzo's lawyers were preparing for the arrest warrant they expected within 48 hours. But Lorenzo knew something the investigators didn't. Those 3 previous murders, a union organizer who had been causing problems at the docks, a journalist investigating money laundering, and a city official who had refused to approve a crucial construction permit, had not been sanctioned by him. When the bodies had turned up and questions had been raised, Lorenzo had conducted his own internal investigation, trying to identify which of his captains had acted without authorization. He had never found the answer, but he had noted the pattern. Someone in his organization was conducting unsanctioned hits and doing so in a way that created exposure for the entire enterprise. Now those murders had come back to frame him for killing a cop. The architect of this conspiracy had been planning it for over a year, laying groundwork, creating patterns, building a case that would be impossible to defend against in court. And the timing suggested urgency. Something had accelerated the timetable, forced the traitor's hand, made them move before their plan was perfect. Lorenzo stood and walked to the window again, watching the city wake up despite the rain. Delivery trucks navigated narrow streets. Shop owners opened shutters. Early commuters hurried through the downpour. None of them knew that their city's underground power structure was fracturing, that the careful balance Lorenzo had maintained for years was about to collapse into violence that would spill into their world. He made his decision with the clarity that had always defined his leadership. He would not run. He would not hide behind lawyers and procedural delays while his organization fell apart. He would hunt the traitor, expose the conspiracy, and do so in the narrow window of time before the police arrested him. It would require moves that bordered on reckless, contacts he had avoided for years, and a willingness to trust people who had every reason to betray him. Dante listened as Lorenzo outlined the plan, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. It would require splitting their forces, reaching out to rivals they had spent years undermining, and trusting information sources that might be compromised. But Dante, who had survived 4 decades in this world by understanding when calculated risks became necessary, nodded his approval. They would need to move immediately, before word spread through the organization, before the traitor could anticipate their next move. Lorenzo began making calls, activating networks he had built over 20 years, calling in favors from people who owed him debts they couldn't refuse. He contacted the head of a rival family in Rome, a man he had nearly gone to war with 3 years earlier, and proposed a temporary alliance based on mutual threat. If Lorenzo fell to a police investigation, the resulting power vacuum would destabilize the entire region. He reached out to a corrupt banker who handled money for half the criminal organizations in Europe, promising information about a federal investigation in exchange for financial records that might reveal patterns in his own organization's accounts. Each call carried risk. Each contact point represented another person who might be working with the traitor, might be part of the conspiracy, might use this moment of vulnerability to strike. But Lorenzo had learned long ago that the greatest danger in their world came not from obvious enemies, but from internal rot, from the cancer of betrayal that grew in darkness. Better to force everything into the light, to create chaos that might expose the hidden disease. By noon, Lorenzo had assembled a picture that terrified him with its implications. Financial records showed irregular payments to a shell company that didn't appear in any of the organization's official ledgers. The amounts were modest, but the frequency suggested regular compensation for services rendered. Surveillance reports from his security team revealed that 3 of his captains had been meeting secretly, always in locations that weren't covered by the organization's usual monitoring. Phone records, obtained through less than legal means, showed encrypted communication patterns that shouldn't exist, because Lorenzo had always forbidden secure communications within the organization, preferring face-to-face meetings that couldn't be monitored by law enforcement. The conspiracy wasn't limited to one person. It involved multiple high-ranking members of his organization, people he had trusted with his life, people who had sworn blood oaths of loyalty. They had been planning this for years, not months. The murder of Marco Santini was just the culmination, the final move that would destroy Lorenzo and allow them to seize control of the entire operation. But there was something else in the data, a pattern that didn't fit the simple narrative of ambitious underlings eliminating their boss. The traitors had been careful, almost too careful, in ways that suggested they feared not just Lorenzo's retaliation, but someone else's surveillance. Their encrypted communications used protocols typically employed by intelligence agencies, not criminals. Their meetings took place in locations that offered not just privacy from Lorenzo's people, but from everyone. No cameras, no witnesses, no digital footprints. Lorenzo realized with cold certainty that the conspiracy reached beyond his organization. Someone from the outside world, law enforcement, a rival organization, possibly even government intelligence, was coordinating with his traitors, using them to dismantle his empire while maintaining plausible deniability. Marco Santini's murder wasn't just about framing Lorenzo for a cop killing. It was about creating chaos that would justify extraordinary police action, possibly military intervention, definitely destruction of the careful balance Lorenzo had maintained between the criminal world and legitimate society. Cathedral confrontation. 3 days passed in a blur of revelations and desperate moves. Lorenzo had identified 5 individuals at the core of the conspiracy. 3 of his captains, his head of security and, most devastatingly, his nephew Carlo, who Lorenzo had been grooming as his eventual successor. Each betrayal cut deeper than the last, challenging everything Lorenzo believed about loyalty, family, and the organization he had built. The funeral for Marco Santini was held at the Duomo, Milan's magnificent cathedral, with thousands attending, including police officers from across Europe. Lorenzo watched the ceremony on television, seeing Sofia Moretti deliver a eulogy that spoke of her fallen partner's dedication to justice and his unshakable moral compass. She said nothing about Lorenzo directly, but her words carried an implicit challenge. She would find whoever killed Marco, no matter what power they wielded, no matter what the cost. That night, Lorenzo received a message through a channel he had established years ago for emergencies. It came from Sofia Moretti herself, delivered through a priest who served as an intermediary between the criminal world and law enforcement. The message was simple. She knew Lorenzo didn't kill her partner, and she knew they were both targets of the same enemy. She proposed a meeting, one that would violate every protocol and possibly destroy her career. But she needed answers, and Lorenzo needed an ally who could operate in the legitimate world he couldn't access. They met at midnight in an abandoned cathedral on the outskirts of Milan, a 14th-century structure that had been scheduled for demolition, but remained standing through bureaucratic delays. Rain still fell, drumming against stone and broken stained glass, creating an atmosphere of desolation that matched the gravity of their situation. Lorenzo arrived with only Dante, deliberately leaving his security detail behind as a gesture of trust. Sofia came alone, her service weapon visible on her hip, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept properly since watching her partner die. They stood in what had once been the nave, beneath a ceiling partially open to the sky, rain falling between them like a curtain neither could cross. Sofia spoke first, her voice carrying the controlled anger of someone forcing themselves to remain professional when every instinct demanded vengeance. She laid out what the police investigation had uncovered: the ballistics match, the pattern of murders, the circumstantial evidence that all pointed at Lorenzo. But she also revealed what she hadn't told her superiors. Marco had left notes about a separate investigation he had been conducting privately, suspecting corruption within both the police force and the criminal organizations they monitored. Marco Santini had discovered evidence of a conspiracy that transcended the usual boundaries between law enforcement and organized crime. He had found financial connections between specific police officers and shell companies controlled by members of Lorenzo's organization. He had documented meetings between prosecutors and criminals that shouldn't have occurred. He had built a case suggesting that someone was orchestrating a merger, attempting to create a hybrid organization that would control both sides of the law, using the infrastructure of crime to enrich themselves while using the power of law enforcement to eliminate competition. Marco had been killed because he had gotten too close to exposing this conspiracy. And his dying words had been meant not as an accusation, but as a warning. Lorenzo De Vincenzi was the next target. Once Lorenzo was eliminated or imprisoned, the conspirators would control his organization without opposition, and the merger of criminal power and legal authority would be complete. Sofia handed Lorenzo a folder containing copies of Marco's notes, evidence she was risking her career to share because she understood that conventional investigation wouldn't work here. The conspiracy had infiltrated too deeply into law enforcement. Any official investigation would be compromised, witnesses would disappear, and evidence would be suppressed. The only way to expose the truth was through unconventional means, through cooperation between two people who should be enemies, but who shared a common cause. Lorenzo read through Marco's notes, his mind racing through implications and connections. Several of the names Marco had identified matched his own suspects within the organization. But there were others, people Lorenzo had never considered threats, including members of the police force he had assumed were simply taking modest bribes for information. Standard corruption, nothing systematic. Now he saw how those small compromises had been leveraged into something larger, how the conspiracy had recruited people on both sides gradually, building its network over years while remaining invisible to both legitimate and criminal oversight. The rain intensified, and somewhere in the ruined cathedral, something moved. Both Lorenzo and Sofia reacted instantly, weapons appearing. Sofia drew her service pistol, while Lorenzo pulled a gun from his shoulder holster, both training their sights on the darkness at the cathedral's far end. Dante, who had been standing near the entrance, moved to flank their position, his own weapon drawn, his decades of experience evident in the professional calm of his movements. 5 figures emerged from the shadows, and Lorenzo's heart turned to ice as he recognized them. Carlo, his nephew, led the group. Beside him stood Marco Rossetti, Lorenzo's head of security, and Tommaso Carbone, one of his most trusted captains. The other 2 were police officers Sofia immediately recognized, including her own lieutenant, a man who had worked organized crime for 15 years and who had been present when Marco Santini died. Carlo spoke first, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had been acting a role for too long and now finally revealed his true face. He explained with chilling casualness how the conspiracy had developed over 7 years, how they had identified the most ambitious and corruptible individuals on both sides, how they had positioned themselves to seize control of Milan's entire underground economy while having the legal authority to suppress any opposition. Lorenzo's organization would be dismantled through legal prosecution, his assets seized, his people arrested or killed. And in the chaos that followed, the new hybrid organization would emerge, more powerful than anything that had existed before. Marco Santini had been killed because he had discovered bank records that would have exposed the conspiracy's financial infrastructure. His investigation had been meticulous, building a case that would have survived legal scrutiny and resulted in dozens of arrests on both sides. So they had eliminated him, using the murder to frame Lorenzo and accelerate their timeline. They had expected Lorenzo to run or hide, to make mistakes driven by panic. They hadn't anticipated that he would investigate, that he would identify the conspiracy, that he would find allies like Sofia who valued justice over institutional loyalty. Carlo revealed the final piece with particular venom. The conspiracy had grown from a conversation he had with Marco Rossetti 4 years ago, frustrated by Lorenzo's caution, by his refusal to expand more aggressively, by his old-fashioned notions about boundaries and rules. They had connected with corrupt police officers who shared their ambition, and together they had built something new, something that transcended the limitations of being either purely criminal or purely legal. They would control everything, and those who opposed them would be crushed under the combined weight of criminal violence and state authority. The cathedral's ruined interior became a stage for confrontation years in the making. Sofia's lieutenant ordered her to lower her weapon, to accept that she was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Carlo told Lorenzo that his reign had ended, that the old ways he represented were obsolete, that the future belonged to those willing to abandon outdated concepts like loyalty and honor. The traitors spread out, weapons drawn, confident in their numerical advantage, but they had made a crucial mistake. They had assumed Lorenzo and Sofia stood alone. They hadn't noticed Dante's positioning, hadn't considered what a man who had survived 4 decades in this world might have planned. And they hadn't anticipated that Lorenzo, expecting betrayal, had positioned his most loyal people outside the cathedral, waiting for his signal. The explosion of violence was sudden and brutal. Dante moved first, taking down one of the corrupt police officers with 2 shots that echoed like thunder in the cathedral's acoustics. Sofia fired simultaneously, her bullet catching Marco Rossetti in the shoulder, spinning him around. Lorenzo dove behind a stone pillar as Carlo's return fire chipped fragments from ancient masonry. The ruined cathedral became a chaotic battlefield, muzzle flashes illuminating centuries-old frescoes, gunfire drowning out the sound of rain. Lorenzo's reinforcements stormed through side entrances. 6 men who had served him since the beginning, whose loyalty he had never doubted, who had been waiting outside with instructions to intervene if he gave a specific hand signal. The numerical advantage shifted instantly. The firefight intensified, bullets ricocheting off stone, shattering what remained of stained glass windows, turning holy ground into a war zone. Through the chaos, Lorenzo kept his focus on Carlo. His nephew had taken cover behind the altar, firing methodically, trying to reach the cathedral's rear exit. Lorenzo moved through the darkness with the practiced skill of someone who had survived assassination attempts before, flanking Carlo's position, cutting off his escape route. Their eyes met across the ruined sanctuary, and in that moment, Lorenzo saw not his nephew, but a stranger, someone who had worn a mask so convincingly that Lorenzo had never glimpsed the ambition and resentment beneath. The firefight ended as suddenly as it began. Tommaso Carbone and both corrupt police officers lay dead or wounded. Marco Rossetti had fled through a side exit, clutching his injured shoulder, leaving a trail of blood. Sofia's lieutenant had surrendered when 3 of Lorenzo's men surrounded him, his weapon clattering to the stone floor. And Carlo remained behind the altar, his ammunition spent, his escape routes blocked. Lorenzo approached slowly, his weapon trained on his nephew, rain falling through the broken ceiling to mix with blood on the cathedral floor. Dante and Sofia maintained covering positions, while Lorenzo's men secured the perimeter. The silence after the gunfire felt profound, broken only by rain and the labored breathing of wounded men. Carlo laughed, a bitter sound devoid of humor. He asked if Lorenzo would kill him now, if family meant so little that he could murder his own nephew over betrayal. Lorenzo stopped 3 meters away, lowering his weapon slightly but not holstering it. He told Carlo that family meant everything, which was why this betrayal cut so deeply, why the conspiracy had succeeded as long as it had. Lorenzo had trusted Carlo completely, had shared secrets and strategies, had given him access to every aspect of the organization. And Carlo had used that trust to nearly destroy everything. But Lorenzo wouldn't kill Carlo. Not because of mercy or family sentiment, but because Carlo would face something worse than death. He would stand trial for the murder of Marco Santini and the corruption of police officers. Sofia, with the evidence Marco had compiled and the testimony of the surviving conspirators, would ensure that the entire conspiracy came to light. Carlo and his allies would spend decades in prison, their reputations destroyed, their ambitions turned to dust. That punishment, Lorenzo said, was more appropriate than a quick death in a ruined cathedral. Sofia handcuffed her lieutenant while calling for backup on an encrypted line, using channels she trusted hadn't been compromised by the conspiracy. She arrested Carlo as well, reading him rights he barely seemed to hear. The evidence was overwhelming. Marco's notes, combined with what had just transpired, would ensure convictions. The hybrid organization the conspirators had tried to build would be exposed and dismantled. Law enforcement would be forced to confront the corruption within its ranks, and Lorenzo's organization would undergo its own purge of traitors. As police sirens approached in the distance, Lorenzo and Sofia shared a final exchange. She acknowledged that he had helped her bring justice for Marco, but she warned him not to mistake temporary cooperation for permanent accommodation. She would continue investigating his organization, would continue working to dismantle criminal enterprises, would not compromise her principles because of one alliance in extraordinary circumstances. Lorenzo accepted this with a slight nod, respecting the clarity of her position. Before leaving, Sofia asked Lorenzo why he thought Marco had spoken his name with his dying breath instead of naming Carlo or the other traitors directly. Lorenzo was silent for a moment, considering the question that had haunted him for days. Then he realized the truth. Marco had known that speaking the conspirators' names would have exposed them too soon, would have caused them to scatter before their full network could be revealed. But speaking Lorenzo's name would set in motion exactly what had transpired, an investigation that would eventually uncover the entire conspiracy. Marco had trusted that Lorenzo would understand the message, would recognize it as a warning rather than an accusation, would have the resources and motivation to expose the truth. It was, Lorenzo reflected, a final act of faith from a man who believed in justice even as he died. Marco Santini had saved Lorenzo's life twice, once 12 years ago by finding the truth, and once again by speaking his name with his final breath. The weight of that debt could never be repaid, but Lorenzo would honor it by ensuring that Marco's death meant something, that the conspiracy he had died exposing was completely destroyed. Aftermath in the rain. The rain finally stopped 3 days later as Milan prepared for another funeral, this time for the police officers and criminals who had died in what the media called the Cathedral Incident. The full story would take weeks to emerge as investigators untangled the conspiracy's complex web. Dozens of arrests followed, spanning both law enforcement and organized crime, as the hybrid organization's network was systematically dismantled. Lorenzo stood again at his penthouse window, watching the city under clear skies for the first time in a week. Dante stood beside him, reviewing reports of the organization's restructuring. 6 captains had been removed, their territories reassigned to more trustworthy people. The security protocols had been completely overhauled, with new systems designed to prevent the kind of long-term infiltration that had nearly destroyed them. Trust would have to be rebuilt slowly, painfully, with every relationship in the organization re-examined and verified. But the conspiracy's exposure had created an unexpected opportunity. Other criminal organizations, seeing how close they had all come to being absorbed by the hybrid system, had reached out proposing cooperation and information sharing to prevent future infiltration. Law enforcement, shocked by the corruption within its ranks, had launched internal affairs investigations that were actually genuine rather than performative. The boundaries between the criminal world and legitimate society would remain, but now both sides understood that some threats transcended traditional rivalries. Sofia Moretti had been promoted to detective sergeant and assigned to lead a special unit investigating corruption in law enforcement. Her first case had resulted in 14 additional arrests, including 2 prosecutors and a judge who had been facilitating the conspiracy's operations. She had visited Marco's grave and spoken to his headstone, telling him that she had found his killers and exposed the conspiracy that had taken his life. She didn't mention Lorenzo by name, but in her report about the cathedral incident, she had carefully structured her narrative to minimize his role while maximizing the focus on the corrupt police officers and the traitors from his organization. Lorenzo received word that Carlo had agreed to testify against the remaining conspiracy members in exchange for a lighter sentence. His nephew would spend 15 years in prison rather than life, a compromise that left Lorenzo feeling empty rather than satisfied. Family betrayal carried wounds that never fully healed, creating scar tissue that would ache whenever Lorenzo thought about the succession plans he had made, the future he had envisioned with Carlo at his side. But life continued, as it always did in Milan. The city moved forward, ignorant of how close it had come to being controlled by a shadow organization that transcended every boundary. Shop owners opened their businesses. Families gathered for Sunday dinners. The Duomo's bells marked the hours with timeless constancy. And beneath the surface, in the hidden places where power flowed through unofficial channels, Lorenzo De Vincenzi continued to operate, more cautious now, more aware of the fragility of trust, more conscious that every position of power made one a target for those who wanted what you had built. Final reckoning. 6 months after the cathedral incident, Lorenzo returned to the abandoned cathedral where the confrontation had occurred. The building was now genuinely scheduled for demolition, with construction equipment parked outside and warning signs prohibiting entry. But Lorenzo bypassed the barriers easily, walking through the same entrance he had used that rainy night. The interior looked different in daylight, streaming through broken stained glass. Blood had been cleaned away, bullet holes marked but not repaired. The altar where Carlo had made his final stand, now covered in dust and debris. Lorenzo walked through the space slowly, remembering the chaos of gunfire, the moment when his world had hung in balance between exposure and survival. He stopped before a shattered cross that lay on the floor, broken during the firefight, its ancient wood splintered but still recognizable as the sacred symbol it had once been. Lorenzo knelt beside it, his expensive suit absorbing dust, his hand reaching out to touch the fractured wood. The words came unbidden, spoken to the empty cathedral, or perhaps to the memory of a cop who had saved his life twice without ever accepting anything in return. "You were right, Marco. It was always me they wanted dead. Not because of what I'd done, but because of what I represented. The old ways, the boundaries, the rules that even criminals once followed. They wanted to create something new by destroying everything you and I both believed in, each from our different sides. You died trying to stop them. I survived only because you warned me." Lorenzo stood, looking around the ruined cathedral one final time. The building would be demolished soon, erased from Milan's landscape, as if it had never existed. But what had happened here would resonate for years, a reminder that power always attracted those who believed they deserved it more than whoever currently held it. The price of leadership was eternal vigilance against not just external enemies, but the cancer of betrayal that grew from within. He left the cathedral and returned to his car, where Dante waited with the day's reports and decisions requiring Lorenzo's attention. Life continued. Power remained concentrated in his hands. The organization had been purged and strengthened. But Lorenzo carried with him the knowledge of how close it had all come to ending, how a dying cop's warning had been the difference between destruction and survival. That night, from his penthouse window, Lorenzo watched Milan's lights spread across the darkness like a constellation of human hopes and ambitions. Somewhere in that vast sprawl of humanity, future threats were being born, ambitious underlings, corrupt officials, rival organizations calculating their moves. The game never ended. It only paused between rounds, gathering energy for the next conflict, the next betrayal, the next desperate struggle for survival. But for now, Lorenzo had something he hadn't possessed in months. Clarity about who he could trust, certainty about the threats he faced, and respect for the memory of a man who had been his opposite in every way, except the one that mattered most: integrity. Marco Santini had lived and died according to principles that transcended personal benefit or institutional loyalty. And in the end, those principles had saved them both, even if only one survived to remember. Lorenzo raised a glass of whiskey to the city below, a silent toast to fallen enemies, dead heroes, and the complex truth that justice sometimes required cooperation between people who should have been adversaries. The conspiracy had failed, the traitors had been punished, and the boundaries between criminal and legal would hold, at least until the next ambitious person decided those boundaries were obstacles rather than guardrails. The rain returned as Lorenzo turned from the window, soft at first, but building toward another storm. Milan would endure, as it always had through centuries of conflict and change, and Lorenzo de Vincenzi would endure with it, carrying the weight of power and the burden of knowledge about what that power cost, not just in money or influence, but in trust betrayed, family destroyed, and the constant awareness that survival required the kind of vigilance that never allowed for peace. The dying cop had whispered a name, and that whisper had echoed through the criminal underworld and law enforcement alike, exposing conspiracies, punishing betrayal, and ultimately proving that some principles transcended the boundaries between right and wrong. Marco Santini's final gift had been the truth, delivered with his last breath, trusted to reach the one person who could act on it before it was too late. And Lorenzo, standing in his penthouse as rain hammered against the windows, understood that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that trust, knowing he would always fall short but compelled to try nonetheless. Because in a world where betrayal was currency and loyalty was increasingly rare, the fact that a dying cop had trusted him with the truth meant more than any empire, more than any power, more than anything else Lorenzo had accumulated in his 42 years. The city lights blurred in the rain, and Lorenzo closed his eyes against the sudden weight of emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel. When he opened them again, his face had returned to its customary careful neutrality, the mask he wore that revealed nothing and protected everything. But somewhere behind that mask, in a place even Dante couldn't access, Lorenzo carried the memory of a dying cop's trust and a warning that had saved his life. The story would fade from headlines, become another legend whispered in Milan's shadows, eventually transform into myth as new crises captured public attention. But those who had lived through it would remember the detective's partner who had risked everything for justice, the crime boss who had chosen honor over expedience, and the conspiracy that had almost succeeded in rewriting the rules of power itself. As the storm intensified outside, Lorenzo returned to his desk and the endless work of maintaining an empire built on carefully calibrated violence and strategic relationships. The rain would eventually stop. The sun would rise again over Milan. And somewhere in the distance, the next threat was already gathering strength, planning moves that Lorenzo would need to anticipate and counter if he hoped to survive. But for tonight, he allowed himself the smallest moment of satisfaction. The conspiracy had been exposed. The traitors had been punished. Marco Santini's death had been avenged. And the dying cop's warning had proven that even in the darkest corners of the criminal world, there remained something that transcended power and survival. The possibility of understanding between enemies, cooperation across impossible boundaries, and the enduring belief that justice, however imperfect, remained worth fighting for. The story ended not with resolution, but with continuation. Because in Lorenzo da Vincenzi's world, nothing ever truly ended. Threats evolved, alliances shifted, and the game continued with new players entering as others fell. But the dying cop's whisper would remain, echoing through the years, a reminder of the price of power and the unexpected forms that salvation sometimes took. Thank you for following this story of betrayal, conspiracy, and unlikely alliance in the shadowed streets of Milan. If you enjoyed this narrative of justice pursued across boundaries that should never be crossed, subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the complex realities of crime, loyalty, and the human capacity for both betrayal and honor. Each week we bring you new tales that challenge assumptions about right and wrong, revealing the gray spaces where most human decisions actually occur.